Okay, so today we're tackling a massive issue, one that's been bubbling just under the surface in South Africa for years: youth unemployment. But we're not just going to look at the headlines. We're going deep, because this isn't just a problem, it's a systemic failure. Let's get right into it.
South Africa has one of the youngest populations on the planet. And if you open any Economics 101 textbook, that's supposed to be a golden ticket. It's what they call a demographic dividend, a massive wave of young, energetic people ready to power growth and build a future.
But the reality? It's the exact opposite. What should be this incredible source of strength has turned into one of the country's biggest risks. And that's what we're digging into here, why this is happening based on a whole decade of data.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the numbers, and trust me, they are alarming. Then, we'll talk about the disengagement crisis. What happens when people just give up? After that, we'll unpack the systemic traps that are literally locking an entire generation out of the economy. And finally, we'll ask, who is paying the biggest price for all of this?
All right, let's start with those raw numbers, because you really have to see these figures to understand just how serious this situation is.
A decade ago, the youth unemployment rate was already a staggering 37%. Today, it's jumped to over 46%. Just let that sink in for a second. We're talking about nearly half of all young people who are actively trying to find a job and are being told there's nothing for them.
But believe it or not, it actually gets worse. If you narrow it down to the youngest group, we're talking 15 to 24-year-olds, that rate explodes to over 60%. 60! For most young South Africans, their first experience of the adult world isn't opportunity, it's a locked door.
And look, this isn't some short-term problem like a recession or a bad year. This has been the reality, day in and day out, for a decade. And here's the most important thing to get. When a problem goes on this long, it's not an accident, it's structural. It's built into the system itself.
But you know that official unemployment number, it doesn't even tell the whole story. There's a much deeper crisis going on just beneath the surface, and that's a crisis of disengagement.
Just think about it for a minute. The unemployment rate only counts people who are out there actively looking for a job. But what about all the people who have just stopped, who've completely given up?
Well, economists actually have a name for them: discouraged workers. And these aren't lazy people. These are people who want to work, who are able to work, but they've been rejected so many times that they've come to believe the system is rigged and their effort just won't pay off.
And this really gets to the true cost of all this. See, when a huge chunk of a generation just checks out, the economy doesn't just lose workers, it loses momentum. It loses future taxpayers. And maybe most importantly, it loses hope. And a society that's losing hope is heading down a very dangerous road. So, the big question is, how did we even get here? Why is it so incredibly hard for a young person to get that first job, to just get a foot in the door? Well, the answer is in a series of really nasty systemic traps.
Take a look at this number. It is absolutely staggering. More than half of all unemployed young people in South Africa have never ever had a job. They're not getting laid off, they are simply never getting hired in the first place.
And this sets up this impossible catch-22, right? Employers say they want people with experience. But how on earth are you supposed to get experience if no one will give you a job? That critical bridge that's supposed to connect your education to your first job, it's just completely broken.
In most other economies, this gap is filled by things we're all familiar with: apprenticeships, paid internships, programs designed to bring new people into the workforce. But in South Africa, that kind of support system is mostly missing. And that means the full weight of being inexperienced falls right on the shoulders of young people who have no money and no backup plan.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. Okay, but the answer is education, right? Just get a degree. Well, the data shows us something a lot more complicated and, honestly, a lot more uncomfortable.
So let's be super clear. Getting an education definitely helps. Graduates have a much better shot at finding a job than non-graduates. But look at this. Even if you have a university degree, nearly 1 out of every 4 young graduates is still unemployed. So education lowers your risk for sure, but it is no longer a guarantee of a job.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? We're telling young people to work hard, to invest their time, their family's money into getting an education, with this promise of a better life. But the economy on the other side simply isn't creating enough jobs for them. That mismatch, it just breeds so much frustration.
And that brings us to our last point. This crisis doesn't just create unemployment, it actively locks in inequality for the long term. And this burden is not being shared equally at all.
So to really get this, we need to talk about a term you'll hear a lot, NEET. It's an acronym and it stands for Not in Employment, Education, or Training. It's basically a way to describe young people who are completely disconnected from everything.
And when you look at who falls into this NEET category, the gender gap is just shocking. Nearly half of all young women in South Africa are in this group. They are hit so much harder, often because of things like childcare duties, personal safety concerns, and the huge amount of unpaid work they're expected to do.
And okay, what about the young people who do manage to find work? Well, the type of job they get is really important. A lot of the time, it's in retail or services or in the informal sector. And while these jobs are an absolute lifeline, they very rarely have a clear path forward.
And that's the real trap. Without a way to grow and move up, that first entry-level job doesn't become a stepping stone to a career. It becomes a permanent ceiling. And that is how the inequality you face as a young person becomes the inequality you live with for the rest of your life.
So, let's pull all of this together. The failure here isn't a lack of reports or studies. It's a failure of urgent, real-world action. And we have to stop looking at this like it's just some number in an economic report. It's not. It's a massive social warning signal flashing red.
At the end of the day, a country that can't find a place for its young people is just storing up massive problems for the future. So the debate can't be about whether we can afford to fix this anymore. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, can we possibly afford the cost of doing nothing?